Welcome into Inside Carolina's Next Level, a YouTube show that features Greg Barnes and me, Tommy Ashley, discussing a little bit deeper into the weeds when it comes to North Carolina athletics. And today we really get into the weeds and into the numbers as Greg has worked on his financial report article for InsideCarolina.com. Make sure you check out that article if you haven't already. But Greg, let's sort of go through the financials. Everybody talks about college sports as big business. North Carolina with 28 total teams in the athletic department, 15 of those women's, 13 men's teams. A lot to sustain, Greg. Sort of talk about what you saw overall, and then we'll sort of get into the nuts and bolts of it. I think it's a fascinating document, a 90-page document detailing where every cent goes.
Yeah, for sure, Tommy. And I think people need to understand that in January of every year, the NCAA requires an athletic department and university to provide a snapshot of their revenues and expenses from the prior year. When we're talking about prior year, we're talking about calendar year. So the period that we're actually talking about today, Tommy, is July 1st, 2021 through June 30th, 2022. So it's not this past fall where North Carolina won the Coastal Division and those types of things. It's the prior year. So we're about 6 months after the academic year ends is when these reports are delivered. But it's done annually. It's always submitted in January, and then we can quickly get our hands on them. But as you say, it's just a wealth of information, and it really kind of breaks down, as we'll get into, all different areas of where Carolina was able to generate money and where that money went. And I think really the key thing with this document that we just received, Tommy, is that North Carolina, after really 2 years of dealing with COVID-19, if you remember back to when COVID actually hit, shut down everything in the second week of March 2020, North Carolina, that was when the ACC basketball tournament was taking place. That tournament ultimately was canceled, as was the NCAA tournament. And all of those spring sports were also canceled. And then you had the whole situation the next year, 2020, 2021, where you had the COVID-19 capacity limits. And so North Carolina, for example, the entire year of 2020, 2021, they brought in less than $1 million in ticket sales across all 28 sports. That is a primary revenue generator for all athletic departments around the country. And so North Carolina was really scrambling to find ways to mitigate losses the last 2 years. And the document that we have for 2021-22 really shows that, hey, everything's kind of back to normal. The sheets are actually looking kind of like what some of the prior ones did before COVID, which obviously is a good thing, Tommy.
Yeah, you mentioned ticket sales, and that's a gigantic part of it. And you would assume, and I think rightfully so, that basketball and football, men's basketball and football, drive everything for college athletics. I mean, I think that's safe to say across the board, across the country, but especially at North Carolina. And Greg, to your point, I'm looking at the first line of the revenue statement, the revenue and expense summary, and it says ticket sales, $30 million and some change. A big difference from $1 million. And that goes to what North Carolina dealt with. Every school did, but North Carolina dealt with the past couple years is if you mention $1 million in ticket sales for a year, and now we're talking 30 million, just a gigantic increase. How is North Carolina able to navigate those 2 years to get to this point where everything's quote unquote back to normal, or at least as normal as we now know it?
Well, the key component was contributions. And what North Carolina was able to do is that when COVID hit, they were able to go to their boosters and other avenues for contributions and just kind of plead their case and say, look, this is a difficult time. We need your help. And so really kind of what happened, you have to give the Rams Club and some other people just a lot of credit for what took place in terms of helping keeping the athletic department afloat. Because if you want to go back to 2020, 21, Uh, the contributions provided was 37.9 million. That is about double what it typically is. And
Wow.
actually, if you look at what happened in 2021, 22, the most recent data we have, it was 19.8 million contributions. And so we're talking about 30 million in ticket sales down to 1 million. Huge difference. And so that 20 million really kind of helped bridge the gap. And then the other part of it too is because you didn't have games where people couldn't come, you didn't have to worry about concessions. You didn't have to worry about parking and all the costs that go into those types of things. And so they were able to mitigate a lot of those costs as well. And so it's really kind of, I don't want to say robbing Peter to pay Paul, but it was something like that where you were trying to figure out, hey, how can we make the math work? And so North Carolina deserves a lot of credit for making that happen. And the Rams club deserves a lot of credit for really doing their part. I believe, I don't have the number right in front of me, but I believe the number in terms of football tickets that were returned, the boosters pretty much gave $4 million back to the school, meaning that instead of asking for a refund for those tickets, they said, you keep it. That'll help the athletic department. I think that total was right at $4 million.
Yeah, for folks that are season ticket holders in Kenan Stadium, I'm one of them. They gave you that option: donate them back, or get a refund. And $4 million is a significant amount there.
Yeah.
Looking at that ticket sales number this year, and again, you're talking about from uh, fiscal year, I guess 2022 or fiscal year, however they do it. Not this past fall. Football and basketball dominated the tickets. I was surprised at this, Greg. Basketball tickets tallied out $16.4 million ish. And folks have to understand I'm rounding a little bit because we'll be here all day because they literally go to the cent. But football was $12.7 million worth. That's a $3.7 million gap there in a much smaller arena compared to Kenan Stadium. Is the downsizing of Kenan Stadium, is that what's going there? Is the Smith Center ticket prices just blown out of whack there? That was surprising to me that basketball, granted there are more games, but basketball tickets were that much more than football in a year.
Yeah, it's a good point, Tom. I think there's a couple parts of this. One, if we go back, I guess 4 years, kind of what we're looking at is it's roughly, it's about 12 million that North Carolina brought in, I guess, for football ticket sales back in fiscal year 2018. Let's say it like that. I think that's probably the easier way to do it, Tommy. And that was prior to when North Carolina reduced capacity at Kenan Stadium. And so you've got a situation where you have reduced capacity in Kenan Stadium. We'll get to that in just a second. But you're only talking about a handful of games a year. And so even though the stadium is much bigger, although Smith Center's sizable as well, 21, 22,000. So when you just kind of do the total math, basketball plays probably 3 times as many home games as football does. And so it kind of adds up and totals out. And typically it is basketball that has a little bit better success in terms of ticket sales. Now, with the Kenan Stadium reduction in capacity, kind of the idea behind the scenes was, yes, we're reducing capacity by roughly 10,000, which is significant when you're talking about ticket revenue. What you would like to do, though, is to create such a fan experience that you increase the value of those seats. One of the benefits is that Mac Brown has been able to say, hey, we've sold out all these games. Well, it's a lot easier to sell out a game, of course, when it's got 10,000 fewer seats. But what you want it to be is a situation where, yes, it's sold out. There's more people interested. If more people are interested, guess what? This is basic supply and demand. You can increase the seat prices. And so I think kind of the long game here is that Carolina has sustained success in football to the point where there's such pent-up demand that you can start increasing ticket prices to kind of take advantage of that increased interest. And that's kind of where things stand right now with COVID really kind of ruining a lot of that back in the 2020 season. That makes things kind of difficult, and they're still trying to kind of get settled out. But I think last year is kind of a good example of, okay, now they're back on their financial footing, if you will, and that can kind of be a baseline of, all right, we know we're at 12 million now. What do we want to get to in the years to come? And then you just kind of work on improving the fan experience and getting the program in better shape, and you can start raising prices to hit those benchmarks.
Yeah, and there's a line there. You raise prices and don't win, then you lose fans, and you lose the common fan. You raise prices but you win, then it certainly becomes a more valuable experience. And I'm a little sometimes you price out the common Carolina fan like they've done somewhat in the Smith Center. I mean, but the numbers reflect that basketball obviously is the more popular sport, and more games, more people want to attend, even more expensive tickets. They've made that kind of money there. One thing about student tickets that I've always thought, and we've talked about more students at games or whatever, and I mentioned to you this off air looking at it. Student fees, 7.8, almost $8 million in this financial report. It is interesting to me that when I was at school at Carolina, we had a young lady that transferred from Oklahoma. She couldn't believe that we got to go to games for free. And I said, well, it's not totally free. They've got student fees. Now, student fees aren't what they used to be. But $8 million in student fees certainly pays for some of those student tickets. I'd be interested to hear if there are any current students watching now. What are those student fees, or parents of current students? I guess I am one. What are those student fees that folks are paying? But anyway, it's fascinating. So tickets and all drive it. Greg, but before we go further, let's talk about the total amounts here. And by my math, and of course looking at the spreadsheets, and it's fascinating how it's done. As I said, 90 pages worth, but revenue 122 million or so overall. Expenses 120 million overall. I mean, when you look at it, you say Carolina made $2 million a year, which is certainly better than they've done in the past, certainly better than they did during COVID. How do you sort of mesh all of that stuff together?
Yeah, it's inflation. Is that the easy answer, Tommy? But it really is as everybody knows is watching this. College athletics is big business, and you keep each year you're trying to bring in more and more. And I think a couple points here. The 122.6 million in revenue, that is a record for North Carolina. That's a lot of money. Conversely, the bad news is that the 120 million in expenses is also a record. And so while revenues keep going up, so do expenses. And obviously, with being a public institution, you're trying to kind of get those numbers to mesh. Prior to COVID, North Carolina had 10 consecutive years of seeing revenue growth. And then, of course, with everything that happened, during COVID, that number dropped down just a little bit. It wasn't a significant amount, but it dropped down a little bit in fiscal year 2021, and then takes another jump forward in fiscal year 2022. And then I think a couple things, and you mentioned it there, in terms of the surplus, just 2.3 million for fiscal year 2022. That comes after 3 consecutive years of a deficit. If you go back to fiscal year 2019, it was right at 3 million in terms of a deficit. Fiscal year 2020, 2.6, and then fiscal year 21, it was only about $50,000 in terms of a deficit. So again, you're kind of trying to keep that balance. But one thing that I think is relevant, Tommy, is when you start looking at coaching salaries and facilities and all those kind of drive expenses up. And then in terms of revenue, something that we talk about all the time at Inside Carolina is these TV deals, media rights deals. And those tend to go up every year as well. And so it really is. I mean, the inflation aspect of it and all of these different areas is both beneficial and hurtful in terms of revenue and expenses. And that's just kind of what Bubba Cunningham and his staff's having to navigate.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting. You're listening to Next Level, Inside Carolina's YouTube show. Greg Barnes, I'm Tommy Ashley, talking about the money. Show me the money aspect of North Carolina athletics. Mentioned earlier about Rams Club donations, roughly $20 million in physical 2022, which is on par usually, which that's a lot of money. I mean, the Rams Club certainly does their fair share. But Greg, you sort of went there a little bit in your previous answer, and this is the elephant in the room for people that talk about big time college athletics, talk about P5, ACC, TV, and all that media rights. And Carolina's payout, if I'm looking at it correctly, was 31.5 million or $31.4 million or so for their media rights deal, which I also found interesting. Football was 24 and a quarter, basketball roughly six in that. But this is where the sort of the rubber meets the road in this day and age with college athletics.
It is for sure. And to expand on those numbers just a little bit, Tommy, media rights, as you mentioned, was 31.5 million. And then with the way that the ACC is structured with the college football playoff, that actually the money from the playoff and from the New Year's Six games actually boosts that total. So UNC's full distribution from the ACC in fiscal year 2022 was 37.7 million. A couple of good things here. Number one, the media rights, the 31.5 million that you mentioned. Well, that's up 16% year over year. That's a good thing. The ACC distribution of 37.7 million, that's up 10% year over year. That's a good thing. The NCAA's distribution, and pretty much all that is directly from the NCAA tournament, both the men's and the women's. That's up 5% to 4 million. So all positive improvements. Here's the difficulty. This is for 2023, so we're a year ahead of time. But projections for the Big Ten in terms of payout is 57 million. So 20 million more than the ACC per team. SEC is projected at 54 million, which is about 17 million more per team. And as we've talked about, that the Big Ten just had a massive deal with a couple of different networks. SEC is going to be redoing theirs. Projections currently are that by 2029, the Big Ten and the SEC are going to be paying out roughly 120 million per team each year. The ACC by that point in time is going to be a little bit over 60 million. So right now, when we're talking about a 20 million or a $15 million gap, that's significant, but you can deal with that. The current trajectory, however, looking out 6-7 years, when we're talking about there being a $50 to $60 million difference per year, I don't know how you can mitigate that at all, Tommy. And so that's one of the issues. The numbers continue to improve for the ACC just year over year. But there's going to have to be something to shake the boat to get those numbers up dramatically if the ACC wants to be able to compete annually with the Big Ten and the SEC.
Yeah, we're sitting there talking about Carolina's revenue is the highest it's ever been at 122 here in fiscal 2022. And like you mentioned, in a few years, these other conferences will be getting just strictly media payouts and close to that amount. I mean, this is a problem. If you take anything away from this show and this discussion, and it's been all over Inside Carolina forever and across the landscape, is that the media rights are going to eat the ACC alive in the way it's currently going. And Greg, quite frankly, we've talked about the grant of rights and all that legalese and stuff that's got the ACC bound in there. I'll step out of what we're talking about, but is there any hope for the ACC given what you just talked about?
Well, just looking at the numbers here for Alabama last year. So this is fiscal year 2021. Their total revenue for the athletic department was 180 million. So 50% higher than North Carolina's this year. They're going to have to get creative. And I think there are some ways to mitigate it. But I think the primary thing, and a lot of people are holding out hope, is Notre Dame. You got to have somebody that comes in and moves the needle. And the reason a team like Notre Dame is what is required is because think about it like this. Let's say North Carolina or the ACC goes out and gets West Virginia. West Virginia is a good program. They'll bring in a new fan base. They'll bring in a new TV footprint, all those things. And let's say that West Virginia, when you add them, well, they bring an extra $30 million to the conference each year. It's not bad, right? But when you divide that among 15 teams, you're talking $2 million a year.
Peanuts.
Peanuts. And that's the issue, is that you can add some of these other teams that aren't big names, and they'll help you a little bit, but it's not moving the needle. And the only team right now that they're going to be able to get to move the needle is Notre Dame. And with the college football playoff expanding the way that it is, why would Notre Dame join a conference unless they have to? And with the expansion of the playoff, they don't have to, as long as they like their NBC deal that's coming up. They've already said, Swarbrick has already said he likes the fact that the Big Ten has a deal with NBC now, because that allows them some flexibility in scheduling some of those games. And so I know there are some ACC head honchos who are holding out hope that maybe they can convince Notre Dame. But I think most people in the ACC understand that's a pipe dream. And so what do you do moving forward to address that? There's a lot of different ideas being floated around about coming up with alliances and creating some fun TV packages with different conferences. But everybody's just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall, if you will, trying to find something that sticks. And thus far, there's not been a really good idea other than trying to convince Notre Dame.
Yeah, it is we could stop it right here, and that's what it's all about. But let's sort of look at the expenses a little bit.
Let me say this before we go there, since we're on this topic, and people may be wondering, well, why didn't Carolina just leave? It's a good question. And as Mac Brown has said a couple times, North Carolina, in terms of the ACC pool of teams, is as well positioned as anybody to be able to make a move and to be desirable to other conferences, namely the Big Ten and the SEC. Here's the problem. The grant of rights deal that the ACC signed a number of years ago after Maryland left locks in their media rights through 2035-36. What does that mean? That means all media rights for UNC belong to the ACC. So if UNC were to leave, the ACC would still get UNC's media rights. On top of that, we don't know what the number is, but there apparently is a healthy exit fee. So you're talking about, what we're talking about media rights of what, 31 million?
Yep.
We're talking 2036. I'm not great at math, Tommy, but what, 400 million plus an exit fee? That's what you're going to have to make up. That is a ton of money. And yes, maybe if you're making 120 million a year in the Big Ten or the SEC, you're going to be able to whittle that down sooner than later. But that is a big risk to try to take. And that's one of the issues and one of the challenges. And until somebody in the ACC takes it to court to challenge, I think everybody else is going to be sitting on their hands waiting for that grant of rights deal to end up coming to a closure. But again, that's 13 years away.
Yeah, I just can't imagine it getting that far. But when you're talking about that kind of money, somebody's going to challenge eventually. And I know it's quieted down in the past few months, but I'm sure it'll pop up again. It's just it's an unbelievable situation, and the deal that the ACC made to lock everybody in is just wow when you think about it. But anyway, let's get back to North Carolina specifically. And again, we're talking about the fiscal year 2022 financial report for North Carolina. Greg Barnes has done an article to go along with this podcast and over at InsideCarolina.com. So check it out. If you're watching this and hadn't read it, check it out. He goes into a little bit better detail than we are here. But Greg, a couple of the big expenses, and I think one, scholarships are about $14 million, and of course football dominates that. But one of the expenses that I look at, and I think, wow, North Carolina seems to be getting a very good deal, and I wanted your take on this, is coaching salaries. And this is everybody across the board, from Mac Brown down to the wrestling coach, down to every coach on staff and all that. And that expense for North Carolina is 25.4 million dollars and change. To me, that is a steal for what North Carolina's gotten, for what North Carolina produces, especially on these, field hockey and lacrosse and soccer and all those, to the greatness that those programs have, um, the success that they've had. But 25.4 million on coaching salaries. What do you think about that number for North Carolina?
Uh, I think North Carolina has done a good job in terms of elevating pools of money. And what I mean by that is when Mac Brown came in, he was willing to take a little bit lower salary, but he wanted to get the salary pool for his assistant coaches elevated. Larry Fedora did the same thing. And so each year, we all kind of look at what the head coach makes. Well, it's really important what your assistants make. And so they've been able to kind of gradually increase those totals year after year. So Carolina's trying to do the right thing. The problem is it's hard to keep up with the SEC and the Big Ten when they're doing the same thing. I think kind of a good example is if you look at Alabama. Saban makes $11 million. His 10 assistant coaches, just the assistant coaches, make 8.2. So just the football staff at Alabama makes 18.2 million. And that doesn't include analysts. That doesn't include any of those guys.
Which they have a warehouse full of.
Correct. And that, again, that's really the challenge, because when we're looking at these totals, Tommy, as we just mentioned, the previous 3 fiscal years, Carolina had lost money. And so they're up, $2.5 million in fiscal year 22, which is a good thing. But it's not like there's just a ton of money available where they can say, okay, well, we're going to add $5 million to the coaching pool. The revenues keep going up, which is a good thing. That allows you to spend more money on coaches. But the expenses are right there with you. And that's really the challenge. And the only way you're able to kind of find more money is look at your big drivers. What are the big drivers that we've already talked about? Ticket sales. I mean, it's not like nobody's going to games. So you're pretty close to what your max is anyway, right? In terms of how much money you can bring in realistically, unless you're just going to jack up prices and play the supply-demand game. And then you've got the $20 million in contributions. Yeah, you would like to see that increase, but how much can that feasibly increase each year? And then you've got the ACC media deal, which we've already talked about. I mean, those are your 3 big drivers. I mean, that's 80 million approximately, or 90 million of the 120 million total revenue. And so that's the catch: is what do you do when you know that you need to keep paying coaches to stay at that level, but you can't? And I think where the SEC and the Big Ten situation is really going to hurt is not the big teams, not football and men's basketball, but it's the lower teams. I mean, you start looking at like the SEC baseball salaries.
Yep.
The lowest paid head coach in the SEC makes more than Scott Forbes does.
I mean, that's
where
significance.
Absolutely. And that's the issue, is that it's going to filter down to all these other programs, and there's just not money there to spend. And so that's the challenge. Again, it's a difficult situation that Bubba Cunningham and his crew is in. And look, there's a ton of programs around the country who don't feel bad for North Carolina, because 120 million in revenue, every other program would love to have.
Indeed. I agree with that 100%. And you're talking about coaching salaries. You mentioned Alabama, and I'm on the page that has it broken down. And listen, we understand that coaches get, vehicles, they get, deals with Jordan or whatever. There's other money for the big coaches, for Hubert Davis, for Mac Brown, or whatever. But just strictly on the documents here, North Carolina's coaching salary for football is about 11, and you just talked about Alabama's at 18. North Carolina's basketball is about 3.5 total on this. This is payments from the university. What's Coach Calipari make? What was Mike Krzyzewski making? I mean,
Coach K was
just
at 9. Yeah.
yeah, just it's mind-boggling the differences here. Granted, Duke's a little bit different, but Calipari at Kentucky and some of these other coaches. I mean, North Carolina is in the bargain bin for coaches' salaries. You mentioned baseball. Baseball doesn't even have $1 million invested in coaching salaries off of this. And you mentioned those SEC schools. It is quite frankly, and maybe I'm being a little over the top. It's quite frankly unbelievable that North Carolina's had the success that they've had across the board in athletics when you look at these numbers compared to other schools. If it's strictly about the money, I said, show me the money earlier. Coaches want to get paid, but the fact that Carolina's been able to have success that they have across the board, the non-revenue sports and all, is amazing to me. Anyway, Greg, what
Well,
else do you see from these?
well, look, and I think an important part of that, Tommy, and this is going to be the issue moving forward. I mean, talk about North Carolina, where they've had the most success in terms of national championships. Karen Shelton has got what, 10?
Mm.
Anson Dorrance has 4,000 or whatever he's got. Roy Williams, Dean Smith. These are all people who started having a lot of success before money was the big thing. I think people forget Mac Brown was making like 275 before he left to go to Texas. So he's making, I mean, what is that? Close to 20 times more now?
Yep.
25 years later? So you have a lot of people who have been entrenched at North Carolina, who have a passionate background with North Carolina, relationship there. And so, yeah, the money's good elsewhere, but they don't want to leave the place they love. Well, the further we get along in this money-making situation, some of those people, like Karen Shelton, are going to retire. Roy Williams retired. Mac Brown's got some time left, obviously. He's eventually going to age out. And so what do you replace those guys with? If you're lucky, there's a Hubert Davis waiting around, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think we can all agree Hubert Davis commands more on the market than what he's being paid. But that's kind of the issue is like now that money is becoming pretty much everything, how do you backfill? And that's one of the challenges that, again, Bubba has all kinds of challenges, and this is just another one of them.
Yeah, the Piper's going to be paid eventually. In North Carolina, like I said, it's amazing the success. But to your point, they're going to have to pony up at some point to pay coaches. I mean, we talk about NIL and paying players, which I still can't wrap my head around. I heard a discussion talking about a couple of players. You're going to have 500 to 600,000 to pay those. Obviously, that's not school money, but somebody's paying it, and and it's just, yeah, it's a thing. But North Carolina's going to have to get in it and get in the game on the coaching salaries as well eventually. Greg, any other takeaways? I know you dig into this stuff each year and just go all into it, and it's a fascinating discussion. What have we missed maybe that folks should check out in your article, or folks should think about when they're talking about North Carolina and North Carolina athletics?
Well, a couple things that just kind of stand out to me that I like to look at. We talk about the value of bowl games, and this is always one that's funny to me. Now that we have the setup with the college football playoff and the New Year's Six bowl games, those are different, right? Because if you go to a New Year's Six bowl game, your conference gets paid $4 million. Great, and that's distributed in the ACC. It's just distributed pretty much evenly. If you get to the semifinals of the playoff, it's $6 million. Beyond that, though, any of these other bowl games, it's much less. And when you're talking about a team of over 100 players and then however many staffers, the costs add up very quickly. North Carolina for the Duke's Mayo Bowl game in Charlotte, which I know a lot of people are trying to forget, in December of 2021, the team brought in $1.6 million in revenue. Well, the expenses, this is for Charlotte, where you can just drive to the game, was 1.3 million. So they netted $280,000, which, hey, that's not bad. But again, I'm interested to see what the cost will be for the Holiday Bowl next year. Because if they're able to actually make money on that, that will be quite impressive. And then we've talked about how basketball and football, men's basketball and football, are the money drivers. And that has always been the case. That will continue to be the case as these media rights deals become bigger and bigger. But 28 sports, men's basketball and football generates 72.5% of the total revenue for the athletic department. And those two sports generated a $42 million surplus in fiscal year 2022. And yet we're talking about the program only bringing in, what, $2 million in surplus? Mm-hmm. So that tells you how much money that men's basketball and football brings in to be able to support everything else that the athletic department does. And that's just a critical factor. And UNC is very fortunate. You've got an incredible blue blood basketball program that brings in a lot of money. And then you've got a ACC football program that brings in pretty good money too. But without those two pillars, Carolina's revenue would be drastically reduced. And that would really play out in your ability to pay coaches and have success across the board.
Yeah, you got a $40+ million surplus for two sports, and you've got 26 other sports that are roughly 40 million in the hole. But that's what makes North Carolina a cool place, is that they are able to fund and support all of those sports across the board for a lot of college athletes that wouldn't get the opportunity otherwise, but for North Carolina's programs. Greg Barnes, it's been fun discussion. Money, you mentioned that Holiday Bowl. If I'm correct, they stayed at the Marriott there on the water in San Diego. I've stayed there.
It's nice, yeah.
That ain't cheap, and they were there for a week. It's going to be interesting to see those bills when they come due. Maybe we'll do this show this time next year discussing that. If they made money off of that trip, that is, I need them doing my finances. That's Greg Barnes. I'm Tommy Ashley. You've been listening to Inside Carolina's Next Level. If you've got a show suggestion or an idea, hit me up on Twitter or email us, Tommy at InsideCarolina.com or Greg at InsideCarolina.com. We've got some great ones. We'll get to them eventually. Keep sending them. Keep giving us your feedback. We're always around to discuss it. Thanks, Greg.